Hello, everybody, and welcome to the English 1102 Summer Term Lecture on Battle Royal by Ralph Ellison. Now, of course, you've been through this before probably, since this is the fifth story on the list, but in case you haven't, go ahead, after I tell you to, hit the pause button, and go ahead and open up the slideshow that's in the English 1102 folder on prose, the English 1102 prose folder, and open up the English 1102 Summer 2015 prose slideshow. And then go to slide number 31. So go to slide number 31. It'll have a picture of Ralph Ellison sitting in front of a bookcase. And then also, if you're in this book, then you'll go to page 209, because we will be reviewing some of the passages from this book during the course of this presentation. So I'll go ahead and pause for a minute while you find that slideshow and find page 209 in the book. If you're not using this book, whatever source you're using Battle Royal for, please have it available so that we can discuss it throughout the lecture. And I'm pausing now. All right, we're back. So let's get started on Battle Royal by Ralph Ellison. I'm going to go ahead and open up my slideshow as well. And Battle Royal is actually the opening chapter of a much larger novel that Ellison wrote called Invisible Man. Not The Invisible Man, that is a science fiction story, but just plain Invisible Man without the article "the" in front of it. He published this in 1952, and it was one of the greatest works of African American literature in history. It's a story about a young man whose name we never learned. So if you're looking for the young man's name in this story, you won't find it because he purposely left it out. And it's his struggle to try to fit in to a world that is very, very segregated, or at least the United States that is very, very segregated, and all of the conflicts and battles he had to overcome for that. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, slide number 32 there. And you'll see that there are many different levels of conflict in this story. We've got man versus man. This conflict plays out as our narrator is in a boxing ring, blindfolded, swinging wildly probably, and he's having a hard time because punches are coming at him and landing, and he's trying to hit people and he can't, and he really doesn't want to be in there fighting anyway. But these other 9 boys don't like him. If you'll remember, as they're riding in the elevator to get to the ballroom where all this activity takes place, it's the other 9 boys don't like him because, if you'll remember, he took one of the slots away from another boy who would normally have been a part of that group, and would normally have gotten the $5, as it turned out, to participate in these activities where he gets tortured. Let me go ahead and set the stage here before we continue on with these levels of conflict. This story takes place in the South, most likely Alabama, because he goes to the state Negro school at the end of the story, and when I say the Negro school, I'm using the narrator's own words. I'm not using my words. But he goes to the local HBCU, which seems to resemble Tuskegee quite a lot. So it's believed that this story, even though he doesn't say it took place in Alabama, it's a likelihood that it is. Let's talk also about what the narrator wants more than anything else in this story, and that is to deliver a speech. Remember, and of course that's on your slide at the very bottom there. He is given a speech at his high school graduation. Now remember, this is the segregated South, so he didn't give it in front of all the white students. He gave it at the other high school, the high school where the African Americans were relegated to. And one of the reasons why there needed to be integration in schools throughout the country was because the so-called Negro schools, if you will, did not get as much funding as the white schools did. They did not get as good of teachers as the white schools did. They did not get the brand new textbooks like the white schools did. They basically got the white schools hand-me-downs. The buildings were not all that great. So essentially what happened was there was a real need to integrate the white students and the students of color together, because the quality of education in these African American schools were not as good as the education that the white kids were getting. And of course, what you have to also remember is that all these town leaders in this room, the ones that are smoking the cigars and the ones that are drinking the alcohol in mass quantities and the ones that are torturing these boys, are all white. And they essentially want this narrator and his friends to know that we are in charge, you do what we say, and we are going to have a lot of fun torturing you in ways you can't even imagine. And we'll get to some of those in detail as we go through this. So, but anyway, our African American narrator here of this story wants to prove that he is just as smart as his white counterparts and that he can be just as valuable to his community as his white counterparts. And so we're going to look at that as we go through this. So now, going back to the slide, let's go back to the many levels of conflict. So we got man versus man. We've already established he's in a boxing ring. Man versus society. These are the town leaders. And this is a very, very intense conflict because it's white versus black, essentially. It's, our young African-American male being victimized by the white town leaders that want to make sure he knows his place. And when we get to the most intense part of this story, when he lets that word equality slip out accidentally, then you really get a sense of how society wants to keep him down, how society likes the fact that the whites have all the advantages and the blacks don't, and they want to really keep him down very much. And so you get a sense of that in the climactic scene. Racism, obviously, I don't think I've said anything that would dispute that. And then man versus himself. And I think the best part of this story to illustrate the man versus himself is the moment when the naked white girl is brought out to dance in front of the African American kids. And we'll take a look at that. This is in our textbook. This is on page, let me find it. Let's see. I'm sorry, I'm actually looking through this trying to find this part where it's at. Okay, so this is on the bottom of page 211. This is when the young girl comes out. And it is, let's see, probably about 7 or 8 paragraphs in to the story. And it's the paragraph that starts off, we were rushed up to the front of the ballroom where it smelled even more strongly of tobacco and whiskey. Remember, they're smoking cigars, they're drinking drinks, they're having a good time. All right. Now, also remember that these boys are wearing nothing but a pair of boxing shorts. So they are topless. They are not wearing shirts at all. They are wearing boxing gloves, and they are wearing boxing shorts. And, of course, part of the reason why they're wearing boxing shorts is that when these boys have these reactions that 18-year-old boys will have when they see a beautiful naked woman, the boxing shorts are not going to conceal this. They are going to, the boys, if you'll remember, are actually holding the gloves in front of their crotches, for lack of a better way to put it, to hide the fact that this beautiful, dancing, naked blonde has the effect on them that she's having. All right. So this is in that paragraph. It starts with, we were rushed up to the front of the ballroom. If you're in our textbook, it's the last paragraph on page 211. Rushing to place, there's a sea of those, blah, blah, blah. All right. Then we were pushed into place. I almost wet my pants. A sea of faces, some hostile, some amused, ringed around us, and in the center, facing us, stood a magnificent blonde, stark naked. Now, let's set the stage here, because in 1952, when there was a segregated South, African American boys were not allowed to look at white girls, even if she was fully clothed. They were certainly not allowed to think lustful thoughts about them, and there was almost zero interracial dating going on at this time. It's more common now to see a white girl with an African American boy than it was back then. But back then, it was just not done. You just didn't do it. And in fact, if an African American boy was thought to even look at a white girl the wrong way, he could be taken out and lynched for it. So, here are 10 African American boys wearing nothing more than boxing shorts, standing in a room, and there is, as he says, a magnificent, so probably a Kate Upton looking girl, a magnificent blonde standing there without any clothes on. We continue on. There was dead silence. I felt a blast of cold air chill me. I tried to back away, but they were behind me and around me. Some of the boys stood with lowered heads trembling. Remember, they're trembling because they're scared to death. I felt a wave of irrational guilt and fear. My teeth chattered. My skin turned to goose flesh. My knees knocked. Yet I was strongly attracted and looked in spite of myself. Had the price of looking been blindness, I would have looked. Okay. Here is a boy put in a position. Imagine yourself as an 18-year-old boy. And imagine, picture your own favorite blonde here, Kate Upton, Carrie Underwood, Pamela Anderson, whoever your favorite blonde is. Imagine that you are in a room and she walks in completely naked. If you are an 18-year-old boy, there is one way which you are going to respond. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. And these town leaders know this. So they are basically putting these boys in a compromising position because these boys are not allowed to look and they are not allowed to have lustful thoughts and their body is certainly not allowed to react the way it will. And yet there's nothing the boys can do to stop it. And the town leaders are loving it. They are actually torturing these boys in this way. So this is a bit of a psychological torture here. And this goes to the man versus himself. Because our narrator knows he shouldn't look, and he knows he should not be attracted to this girl, and yet he can't stop himself. But he can't be as obvious as, maybe he wants to be. So there's the man versus himself conflict, and this conflict plays throughout the story, but I think it plays most at this point where the girl is dancing around. All right. Opening statement, the narrator searched for something. So let's go to the very first page, and it really doesn't matter what your source is. Just go to the very first sentence of the story. It goes a long way back, some 20 years. All my life I have been looking for something, and everywhere I turned, someone tried to tell me what it was. I accepted their answers too, though they were often in contradiction and even self-contradictory. I was naive. I was looking for myself and asking everyone except myself questions which I, and only I, could answer. It took me a long time and much painful boomeranging of my expectations to achieve a realization everyone else appears to have been born with, that I am nobody but myself. But first, I had to discover that I am an invisible man. And again, Invisible Man is the title to the novel that this chapter is taken out of. So there it is. He's looking for something. He's trying to discover himself. Many people spend years trying to figure out who they are and trying to discover themselves. I did not become a school teacher right away out of high school or out of college. I took a few wrong paths before I finally became a teacher. Some people get there through their own way. And here's our narrator saying he was looking for something. And who was he asking who he was? Everybody except himself. He was listening to everybody else. That is why he's an invisible man. In fact, he says some people just are born knowing they're invisible. It took me years and years and years of wrong turns to discover that. And if you do like this story enough to read the entire novel, you should read the entire novel, because this is our young narrator, our young unnamed narrator's search for that something or that self-identity and the realization that he is invisible. All right. So next we've got the grandfather's speech. Let's take a look at this for a minute. In our book, it's on page 210. This is the top of 210. This is, it doesn't matter what source you've got. It's about the third paragraph down. It begins, and they believed it. They exulted in it. Okay. So he's talking about his family members and how they have accepted their place in society as being less valuable, if you will, than the whites are. All right. So they believed it. They exulted in it. They stayed in their place. This whole story is about knowing your place, or at least our narrator knowing his place. The African American race knowing their place, especially in the rural, segregated South. And And we'll talk in great detail about this when we get to the scholarship at the end. All right. They stayed in their place, worked hard, and brought up my father to do the same. But my grandfather is the one. Okay, we've got ourselves a little rebel in the camp. He was an odd old guy, my grandfather, and I am told I take after him. Uh-oh. So, here we go. We've got a narrator who takes after the oddball in the family. It was he who caused the trouble. On his deathbed, he called my father to him and said, "Son, after I'm gone, I want you to keep up the good fight. I never told you, but our life is a war, and I have been a traitor all my born days, a spy in the enemy's country ever since I gave up my gun back in the Reconstruction." Remember, this grandfather, because this story was published in 1952, so this grandfather, if our narrator is telling about events of his grandfather's death about 20 years prior to when this story took place, then it is likely that his grandfather was alive during the Reconstruction, when essentially the South had to try to recover from its wounds in the Civil War, and many times Northerners came down. They were called carpetbaggers. The Northerners came down and helped rebuild the South because they could make a huge profit in it. Not because they were benevolent and wanted to help those poor Southerners. They wanted to make a quick buck. So he's saying, I gave up my gun back during this time, during the Reconstruction, and I've been a traitor ever since I did that. All right. Let's keep going. Live with your head in the lion's mouth. I want you to overcome them with yeses, undermine them with grins, agree them to death and destruction. Let them swallow you whole till they vomit or bust wide open. In other words, he's saying, resist from within, son. Be passively aggressive. Smile at them. Say yes, sir, to them. Do anything they say, but resist. Resist what they are trying to do to keep you in your place. Fight the good fight, if you will. Not by, using violence or anything like that, but fight the good fight by destroying the enemy from within. Let the enemy swallow you whole, and boom, come out that way. All right. And then, of course, as soon as he said that, they being the family members, thought the old man had gone out of his mind. He had been the meekest of men. The younger children were rushed from the room, and shades were drawn, and on and on. Learn it to the young ones, learn it to the youngins, he whispered fiercely, and then he died. So the grandfather here, his speech is all about passive aggressiveness, all about passive resistance. Resist from within. Our narrator is resisting from within. He's got his speech where he's talking about social responsibility, and he's given his speech to the enemy, if you will, in this room surrounded by them, after he has already entertained them by being beaten up in a boxing ring and electrocuted on a rug and so on. But he is still trying to find his identity. He's still trying to overcome the prejudices of his time. So speaking of the speech, that's the narrator's main goal. Remember, as he's in the boxing ring, in fact, I think I'm going to go to the boxing ring for a minute and read this to you. In our textbook, this is on page... Page... Oh, shoot, I can't find it. But it is when they are in the boxing ring. And he's getting beat up. And his mind keeps going back to the speech itself. Anyway, it's in there. It's somewhere probably on page 214 of our textbook. Oh, here he is. Okay. On page 214, about just past the midway point. It's a very, very short paragraph. While they're in the boxing ring, the harder we fought, the more threatening the men became. Now remember, the men are taunting these boys from outside the ring while they're swinging in it. And it's almost a dangerous situation because these men that are taunting them and talking about, I want to, in fact, let me see. What was it in the beginning? On page 213. Okay, so if you go to page 213, about midway down, somebody, Let me at him. Let me at him. Let me get at him. Okay. In fact, it's actually towards the top of 213. Get going in there. Let me at that big nigger. So basically, these guys from outside are drunk and they're spoiling for a fight. And they've got a boxing ring and guys wearing boxing gloves. They can do that. So finally, later, a couple of paragraphs after that, ring the bell before Jackson kills him a coon. Someone boomed in a sudden silence, and then I heard a bell clang. So, for these boys' protection, let's not let Jackson get at him because he might kill him with his bare hands. This is the kind of danger that our guy is in. And while he's in this danger, this is again back on page 214, the harder we fought, the more threatening the men became. So, as if they weren't threatening enough by yelling those kind of disparaging words, now they're getting even more threatening. And yet, I had begun to worry about my speech again. How would it go? Would they recognize my ability? What would they give me? So here he is getting beaten up while wearing a blindfold and people yelling very nasty things in the audience. And yet, his mind keeps going back to his speech and how he's going to do it. This speech is what keeps him going. This speech is what really helps him out, helps him get through it. I also want to talk about, while we're on the subject of the speech, so he goes through the boxing ring. So he has to watch a naked lady dance. Then he has to go into the boxing ring and get beat up. He gets knocked out by Tatlock, who is the biggest boy of the bunch. Basically, there was an agreement among the other 9 that since this guy took our friend's spot, we're just going to go ahead and roll out of the ring early, and we're going to let Tatlock knock him out. So remember that this is 9 against 1 because they don't like our narrator at all. Our narrator, if you can imagine, is probably a bookish bookworm type. He's probably the type that likes to read and likes to write, but doesn't like to break out in a sweat of any type. And here he is in a boxing ring. So then, of course, we get to the Tatlock. In fact, before we get to the part I wanted to get to, let's get to the part where Tatlock knocks him out. All right. So this is towards 214 again. This is that great big long paragraph. It's 30 paragraphs into our selection. So you're on page 214 on paragraph 30. About midway through that great big paragraph. So 2 men in tuxedos leaped into the ring and removed the blindfold. I found myself facing Tatlock, the biggest of the gang. I felt sick at my stomach. Hardly had the bell stopped ringing in my ears, and it clanged again, and I saw him moving swiftly toward me. Thinking of nothing else to do, I hit him smash on the nose. He kept coming, bringing the rank, sharp violence of stale sweat. His face was a black blank of a face. Only his eyes were alive, with hate of me, and aglow with the feverish terror from what had happened to us all. I became anxious. I wanted to deliver my speech. So again, here he is standing in front of a ring, Tatlock, a big mountain of a man. If you ever watched Game of Thrones, imagine the mountain coming at you, wanting to kill you. And if you are a big fan of the Game of Thrones, remember what he did to the Viper in that fight for Tyrion's freedom. So imagine the mountain on Game of Thrones coming at you, or the biggest person you've ever seen, the biggest, most violent person you've ever seen. If you're a boxing fan, maybe Klitschko, I think is the name of the heavyweight champion from Russia. So imagine this guy coming at you. And as this guy's coming at him, he says, and again, I'll read this again, I wanted to deliver my speech, and he came at me as though he meant to beat it out of me. I smashed him again and again, taking his blows as they came. Then, on a sudden impulse, I struck him lightly, and we clinched. I whispered, fake like I knocked you out, you can have the prize. I'll break your behind, he whispered hoarsely. For them? For me, son of a bitch. And then, of course, the fight goes on. And, of course, he gets knocked out. So, why do you suppose that he wants Tatlock to take a fall? Think about this for a minute. Our young man has come thinking he's going to deliver a speech with dignity. He has come thinking that he is going to be the center of attention, and that he's going to impress the town's leaders. He's going to make a great impression on them. He's going to do it with dignity, and he's going to show them that he is a smart young man. So if he gets knocked out in a boxing ring by a big mountain named Tatlock, I don't think he's going to be quite as dignified. He's probably going to look silly on his back while the guy counts to 10. And that's exactly what happens. So the speech is the driving force throughout this. Now, knowing that he has just gotten knocked out by Tatlock, knowing that he got thrown onto the electrified rug, because remember, after he touched it the first time, he backed off and said, oh no, no amount of money is worth this. And I think it was the owner of the movie theaters picked him up and threw him into the middle of the rug, so he's flopping around like a fish. Again, he wants to have dignity. He wants to make a great impression on these guys. And he's flopping around like this while he's being electrocuted on this rug, which doesn't look very dignified. So, getting back to the speech part, let us get, and this in our book is on page... on page 217 of our book. This is, about 3 pages from the end of the story. It says 217 in our book. This is after they've been told to go collect their money. All right. So after the rug incident, the MC calls, all right, boys, that's all. Go get dressed and get your money. I was limp as a dish rag. My belt felt like it had been beaten with wires. Now, back felt like it had been beaten with wires. That could be an allusion to slavery, but we won't talk about that in this lesson. But it could be. When we had dressed, the MC came in and gave us each $5 except Tatlock, who got 10 for being the last in the ring. Then he told us to leave. I was not to get a chance to deliver my speech, I thought. I was going out into the dim alley in despair when I was stopped and told to go back. So imagine this, if you will. You are the narrator. You have come to this meeting to give a speech to the town leaders, to make a good impression on them, to show them how dignified you are. You have been beaten up by 9 other boys. You have been knocked unconscious by Tatlock. You were forced to watch a girl dance around naked while men were taunting you. We didn't go into a lot of detail about the taunting, but one man would say, you better look at her, boy, and another man would say, you know better, you better not look at her, and which of the 2 men do you listen to? So you're being torn apart, and so eventually he gives in to his urges and actually looks at her. And you have just been electrified by a rug and thrown into the middle of it so that you were flopping around like some kind of a fish out of water. Your back is hurting, your mouth is swollen, because remember, when he gives a speech, his mouth is full of blood still. Your face is probably bruised up. The worst possible scenario you can imagine. And then you go collect your $5 and are told to leave. His despair, even though it's played down in this, must have been great. He must have been so disappointed, and he must have been so upset that he did not get to do what he came into that arena to do that day, or that ballroom to do that day. This was probably one of the darkest moments of his life. It was certainly the darkest moment of that evening. And then finally, somebody remembers, hey, wait, young man, stop, get over here. You're supposed to deliver a speech. So then you've got then he finally is like, oh, good, thank goodness for all that. All right, so I'm going to the next slide. We've got the town's most prominent white citizens acting like animals. They are drinking, they are smoking cigars, they are using very, very bad language towards these young men. They are entertained by the torture of these young men. We've already talked about this a lot. In fact, speaking of the torture, let's go ahead and go into that moment where the girl's dancing naked. This is in our book, on page 210. No, 211. Okay. This is on page 211 towards the bottom, okay? We're going to pick it up where I left off at. Had the price of looking been blindness, I would have looked. Because, again, I mean, who wouldn't, right? All right. The hair was yellow, yada, yada, yada. I felt a desire to spit on her as my eyes brushed slowly over her body. He gives a description of how perfect her body is. She starts dancing. Actually, this is on page 212. Let's pick up the part where she starts dancing. a slow, sensuous movement. So it's not just dancing around like this. She's basically trying to dance in a provocative manner. The smoke of 100 cigars clinging to her like the thinnest of veils. She seemed like a fair blind girl girdled in veils, calling to me from the angry surface of some gray and threatening sea. I was transported. So he's now, in awe of this woman. Okay. There's a clarinet playing. I then became aware of the clarinet playing and the big shots yelling at us. Some threatened us if we looked, and others if we did not. On my right, I saw a boy faint, and now a man grabbed a silver pitcher from a table, stepped in close as he dashed ice water upon him, and stood him up and forced two of us to support him as his head hung and moans issued from his thick bluish lips. The boy is probably, another boy began to plead to go home. So these boys, the one boy who fainted probably thought it would be better to faint and not risk looking. Another boy is begging to go home, and they're just getting started. He was the largest of the group. And, of course, this would end up being Tatlock. Okay. Then, after the dance is over, okay, this is in the 10th paragraph of our story. This is further down on page 212. This is about midway in that paragraph. Well, maybe not quite midway. No, about the midway point. As the dancer flung herself about with a detached expression on her face, the men began reaching out to touch her. Here are the town's leaders, probably married with children, reaching out to touch this naked woman as she dances around. I could see their beefy fingers sink into her soft flesh. Some of the others tried to stop them, and she began to move around the floor in graceful circles as they gave chase, slipping and sliding over the polished floor. It was mad. Chairs crashing, drinks spilt, and they ran, laughing and howling, after her. Again, these are the town's leaders. These are the mayors, the business leaders, the police chiefs and fire chiefs. These are everybody that is anybody in this town, the people that are supposed to be running the town, and here they are, acting like junior high school boys chasing after this naked woman, hooping and hollering and grabbing at her in inappropriate ways. So, you've got the town's leaders acting like animals. Humiliation, I think we've talked about that to no end. And then this is the final point I want to make, and this is on our final slide of the slideshow, the part about knowing one's place. Our narrator must always know his place in this particular society. So he's gotten tortured by the town leaders, and all he got for it was $5. He went through an awful lot for $5. And I know this takes place in 1952, but imagine probably the equivalent today might be going through all that for $20 or something like that. Not really worth it. He's prevented from giving a speech until after he's already been beaten up by the town leaders and the other boys. Now here's the part. Let's go to the speech itself. This is the part I also want to talk about. This in our book is on page 217. All right. So the superintendent introduces this boy and says that he is the smartest boy we've got out there in Greenwood. Greenwood is probably the black side of town. So, maybe like the subdivision Greenwood or something. I am told that he knows more big words than a pocket-sized dictionary. Big words. This is what's going to make everybody think the guy is smart, is that he knows a bunch of big words. Doesn't always work. All right. More applause. So now, gentlemen, I want you to give him your attention. There I was, still, this is on page 217. There was still laughter as I faced them. My mouth was dry, my eye was throbbing. I began slowly, but evidently my throat was tense because they began shouting, louder, louder. So then he starts giving his speech, and here's what he says. We of the younger generation extol the wisdom of that great leader and educator who first spoke these flaming words of wisdom. A ship lost at sea for many days suddenly sighted a friendly vessel. From the mast of the unfortunate vessel was seen a signal, water, water, we die of thirst. The answer from the friendly vessel came back, cast down your bucket where you are. And of course, you've got this analogy going on. But he keeps going with his speech, right? Talking about casting down the bucket where you are. I spoke automatically. This is the final paragraph on page 217. I spoke automatically and with such fervor that I did not realize that the men were still talking and laughing until my dry mouth, filling up with blood from the cut, almost strangled me. I coughed, wanting to stop and go to one of the tall brass sand-filled spittoons to relieve myself. So, basically, he's trying to cough all the blood out. But a few of the men, especially the superintendent, were listening, and I was afraid. So I gulped it down, blood, saliva, and all, and continued. What powers of endurance I had during those days. What enthusiasm. What a belief in the rightness of things. So that little aside tells you that he's now, when he's telling this story, disenchanted. But he wasn't at the time he was giving the speech. At the time he was giving the speech, he thought that there was right in the world and there was goodness in the world. All right. I spoke even louder in spite of the pain, but still they talked and still they laughed as though deaf with cotton and dirty ears. I spoke with greater emotional emphasis. I closed my eyes and swallowed blood until I was nauseated. Speech seemed 100 times as long before, but I could not leave out a single word. All had to be said, each memorized, nuance rendered, blah, blah, blah. I used the phrase social responsibility, and they yelled, "What's that word you say, boy?" Social responsibility, I said. Now, we're going to get to the part where he slips up. But they're talking while he's talking. They're laughing while he's talking. He's trying to speak louder, even despite the fact that he's got blood and saliva in his mouth, and yet the guys are still ignoring him. If you've ever tried to give a speech and been completely ignored, and believe me, as a school teacher, I have gone into classrooms and gotten upset because I'm trying to give, great information to the students, and they're all texting on their phones. Which, of course, infuriates me because if you're texting on your phone and then you come back to me later and say, "I didn't know I was supposed to do this in my essay," my answer will be, well, why didn't you listen in class instead of texting your friends? So there were no phones and there were no text messages. Well, there were phones in 1952, but there were no pocket phones in 1952 and there were no texts. But these men are so busy talking to each other, they're completely ignoring our narrator. Our narrator wanted nothing more than to give this speech and to make a great impression on the town's leaders. And only a couple of the town's leaders are even bothering to listening to him. Many of them are ignoring him. And some of them are taunting him. And let's get to this taunt. Social responsibility, I said. What? Social? Louder. Responsibility. More. Repeat ability. The room filled with uproar of laughter until, no doubt, distracted by having to gulp down my blood, I made a mistake and yelled a phrase I had often seen denounced in newspaper editorials. Heard debated in private. Social, what they yelled? Equality. The laughter hung smoke-light in the sudden stillness. I opened my eyes, puzzled. Sounds of displeasure filled the room. The MC rushed forward. They shouted hostile phrases at me, but I did not understand. So, there we go. These men are yelling. They are taunting him. They are having a great time until he accidentally lets out a phrase, which it says here he knew better. He saw it denounced in the paper, and he heard debated only in private. He let that word, social equality, slip out of his mouth. And when he does, we now have a problem. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of a Freudian slip, but it's possible that our narrator does want social equality. He believes that social equality can happen. Yet he's living in a time when it is almost impossible. So when he let that word slip out, it may have been the word he really wanted to say instead of the word he was supposed to say, which was responsibility. So they call that a Freudian slip, when you say something accidentally that you're thinking, but you don't mean for the thought to come out through your mouth. And people have Freudian slips all the time. So our narrator here has had a Freudian slip, and the town's leaders now are paying attention to him. They weren't before, but all of a sudden they are now. So let's continue where I left off. Small, dry, mustached man in the front row blared out, "Say that slowly, son." "What, sir?" "What you just said." "Social responsibility, sir," I said. "You weren't being smart, were you, boy?" he said, not unkindly. "No, sir." "You sure about that equality was a mistake?" "Oh, yes, sir," I said. "I was swallowing blood." "Well, you better speak more slowly so we can understand. We mean to do right by you, but you've got to know your place at all times." "All right, now go on with your speech." I was afraid. I wanted to leave, but I also wanted to speak, and I was afraid they'd snatch me down. "Thank you, sir," I said, beginning where I had left off and having them ignore me as before. So, yet when I finished, there was a thunderous applause. Okay. So, our narrator, notice after, the tension is over with, he starts speaking again, and they start ignoring him again. This is a very dangerous time for our narrator. When he's standing in a room of white men, the only black young man in the room, and he says that word accidentally. You weren't being smart, were you? And remember what the man said. We mean to do right by you, but you have to know your place at all times. That is what this whole story is about. This man is being told that he needs to know his place in a time where his place was, being subservient to the white man. All right. So, we get through that, and then we get to the very end, and we're going to talk about this scholarship. They give him a scholarship, and I don't need to read this passage. I think you understand that he got a scholarship. But notice where he got the scholarship to. He got a scholarship to, actually I will read those words, word for word from our book, which is on page 219. So basically they give him a briefcase, they tell him to open it. My fingers are tremble, I complied. So open it and see what's inside, I was told. My fingers are tremble, I complied. Smelling the fresh leather and finding an official looking document inside. It was a scholarship to the State College for Negroes. My eyes filled with tears and I ran awkwardly off the floor. So he has been given a scholarship. He's getting a free ride to go to college. But notice that it is the scholarship to the College for Negroes. He's not allowed to go to the state school. He's not going to be allowed to go to school with their sons and daughters, or at least the town's leader's sons and daughters. He has to know his place. And his place is at the quote-unquote state Negro college, not at the state regular college. So that is, again, playing into the theme of our narrators always being told where his place is, and he's always being told that he needs to know it, and not in any subtle way, but in, obvious ways. Okay, so that's, I think, everything I have to say about Battle Royal. Let me one time go through this sheet here and see what is going on. All right. There is no feminist theory, so we don't need to worry about that. Formalism, none of that. Oh, how does Battle Royal work on many different levels of conflict? We talked about that at the very beginning of this lecture. Marxist criticism. Explain how the elite town leaders in Battle Royal torture the impoverished young American men for their own amusement. Marxist theory is all about power. Who is in charge? Who is in power? So in Battle Royal, it's clear that the white town leaders are the ones that are in charge. And they are clearly suppressing the young African American men because they want them to know their place. So that is something that you could write about if you chose that question. Let's see, new historicism. How are the narrator of Battle Royal and the other boys kept in place by the town leaders? I think we've discussed that ad nauseum. There's nothing under psychoanalytic, and I don't see anything under other questions. So that's it. That's everything I have to say about Battle Royal. And I hope, again, like I have with all of the lectures, that this will help you if you should choose to write about Battle Royal in your paper. I see that, looking at my timestamp, this is the longest of the 5 lectures, so I'm going to go ahead and cut it short here. But again, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me during my office hours. Visit my office if you're on campus. I actually like to be able to put faces with names, and I feel like I do my best work when you're actually sitting at my desk as opposed to doing it through email. But if you can't get to my office because you live out of town or you have a full-time job, then feel free to either contact me by phone or by email, and of course I'll be able to answer your questions then. So that's it. That is Battle Royal by Ralph Ellison.